Tutorials. That tried and true stage of the game where we learn how it works. From the controls, to the game mechanics, or even the story. So if almost every single game you'll ever play has it, why do so many of them do their job terribly? This is Jamie. Let's see if this topic clicks with you. Huh? No, just go. Just play the song, play the end. As an educator, I wanted to dive in the topic from my perspective as, well, guess what? The goal of a tutorial is to educate you on the game. Now, let's set some ground rules. Your definition of what a tutorial looks like might be different from mine. So, to avoid any confusion, here's what I think a tutorial is. A tutorial should have these two things: an overview of the controls, and some type of overview for the mechanics of the game. At some point we'll talk about what makes a good tutorial. There's the rest of the video left after all. But first, let's start with... As I said before, tutorials are designed to teach you about the game. But why? Why not just throw the player straight into the game and forget about tutorials entirely? Just be a gamer. Just get good, right? Well, if I haven't taught anything, throwing people straight into the fire works, but only when that person has something to keep them going. Maybe it's their friends egging them on, or the thought of that sweet victory royale, or the conclusion to the story they've been following. Imagine this scenario. Instead of going to school, children were just left to do as they please. Whether they wanted to work, or play, or whatever else you can think of. Some of you might be nodding your heads at the screen, like that sounds great. But do you really think most children would willingly choose to not play with their friends, to go to school or find a job? Just like how schools can help guide children, tutorials can help guide players into finding their purpose. Hooking them into the story, giving them a taste of what winning feels like, introducing the quest to them, or even showing off the feeling of making sick plays. Whatever it may be, tutorials do more than just show us the controls. But now you might be asking, there's plenty of ways we're commonly introduced to games. The game manual, a relic of the past when games came as a disc in a little plastic box. Training modes, mostly fighting games, but they still exist elsewhere. Text boxes and pop-ups. Tutorial quests, or likely some combination of these. You've probably seen most of these before, whether you like them or not, though I'm certain there's one you haven't noticed. The Invisible Tutorial. Mental Checkpoint has done a great video on this, check them out, link in the description. When a game blends the tutorial and the rest of the game seamlessly. Learning the game without thinking about the learning, without feeling like you're in a tutorial. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't easy, but it's even harder for me to think about games that did this well because you don't realize it's a tutorial. So here's a couple examples I can think of. None of these are perfect by any means. I could point out some flaws in all of these. But for all of them, it never felt like the tutorial was a separate experience from the game, and that's the key. We'll talk more about invisible tutorials in a bit. None of this is new information. I'm sure if you've taken a class in game development, I haven't, then you'll know this already. But if we want to know why the problem still exists, we're gonna have to go deeper. Let's be clear, I'm no game developer. I'm merely someone who wants to be a teacher. But I still know that for a lot of people, tutorials aren't enjoyable. Who would have guessed? Bad tutorials are no different from bad teachers. The only difference, you've got less control of the situation. Make sense so far? There are 2 points I want to click on. Agency. The feeling of control. When people play games, they want to play how they want to. Do what they imagined they could with as little difficulty as possible. That's what agency feels like. You don't want to take that away. And in a section of a game where players are already in a vulnerable state, getting rid of the only thing they do have is possibly the worst decision you can make. Now that's not to say that limiting player choice is bad. In fact, it can be a powerful tool. But it's a tool, not something to be used lightly. Something like cutting off a player until later. The player is told that you can, and you probably will, go to this area, but not yet. Not until you unlock the tools for it. There are plenty other great examples, but the other thing I want to talk about is tutorials aren't relevant. And I don't mean that in the sense that they don't matter. I mean, they tend not to fit into the game world. They don't keep you immersed. Tutorials can be jarring experiences, as more times than not, they will pull you straight out of the action. Let's look at pop-ups. I recently played Tales of Arise on stream. And as much as I love the game and I love the series, Tales of Arise, and a lot of other JRPGs, have the pop-up issue. A new mechanic gets introduced, and rather than seamless integration, the player is suddenly thrown walls of text or thrust into a different section to train the new mechanic. The game lets you know you're in a training mode and not the game. So why does any of this matter? Well, each of these is a barrier of entry, some issue the player has to deal with to enjoy the game. Individually, they aren't that bad, but once they start stacking, that's when it becomes an issue. Every time the player hits one of these points, that's a point where they might just drop the game, and a bad tutorial has both of these or more. So then, what makes Let's get the obvious points out of the way. Tutorials that give the player agency and keep the player immersed. Let's pick apart one of the examples from earlier, Breath of the Wild. But Jamie, Breath of the Wild has no tutorial. There is no explicit tutorial, I won't disagree. But I would argue that the Great Plateau is the tutorial of the game, and here's why. In the Great Plateau, the player is immediately granted access to the Sheikah Slate. With that, the game sets the precedent that the Sheikah Slate is a key item that will let Link interact with a lot of the game's functions. I wonder where else you see the Sheikah Slate, or even those pedestals that you interacted with at the start. I'm sure if anybody's played the game before, you've probably seen tons of these along your journey. The entirety of the Great Plateau has an absolute litany of small little things it does to teach the player how to play the game. For example, the cold mountain with spicy peppers all around the entrances. Or maybe the old man on top of the mountain that gives you something to keep you warm. Or even the other possibility of you cooking the old man a meal that used spicy peppers. Who would have guessed those things help keep you warm when you're cold? Yeah, it does tell you that in the text, but how many of you actually opened the menu and needed to read the description, or didn't skip past the pop-up for the spicy pepper? Now you're almost certainly thinking, Jamie, the pop-ups. We just talked about this. I'll admit, I didn't like the pop-ups, and I'm sure a lot of you didn't either. But I will say that Breath of the Wild did something really well with the pop-ups. First, even though they took you out of the game, they were quick. None of them had a lot of text, and any that did have a lot of text were completely optional flavor text, almost entirely. The functional part was kept succinct. Pick up some food, it shows you right there in hearts how much it'll heal you. A weapon? Guess what? There's the damage right there in numbers. The armor? Same thing. There's the defense in numbers. Any added bonuses were put in that little text box to the side of the numbers. The flavor text below almost never told the player any functional information. While I absolutely berated pop-ups earlier, this is one of the better implementations of it I've seen. It's still not ideal, but it's not bad. At this point, you've almost certainly noticed the one thing that I'm leading you towards, and that's I know I already mentioned invisible tutorials earlier, but I thought I'd go more in depth here. Notice how I prefaced that the Great Plateau was something that many people don't refer to as a tutorial. Well, at the very least, it definitely doesn't have the word tutorial or intro slapped anywhere on it. But that's not the only thing invisible about it. At no point does it really entirely pull you out of the game to tell you anything or teach you anything. That flavor text we mentioned earlier, completely optional, and it's in the menu that you have to choose to go to. Same with the numbers, you don't have to interact with them, you could skip past it. The entire process is seamless, all the way up to the end where the player is given the paraglider. The map opens up and they are left to explore completely freely. But it never feels like you've left a tutorial, you've simply entered a different section of the game. Another game that does this great is Hollow Knight. Minor spoilers incoming, here's the timestamp if you need it. To start, how about the Howling Cliffs? This area functions not only as a tutorial area, but also as an area for players to return to when they've unlocked more abilities. Kinda like that thing I mentioned earlier in the video. Hollow Knight does something else special, weaving in mini tutorials, at least that's what I'll call them, throughout the entire game. Look at this tree. You see this tree? There's a very high chance you saw the same tree at some point playing the game. However, the Resting Grounds is the first time where players get the ability to interact with the spirit trees. It's done so in a safe environment, no enemies, and simple platforming. The game never tells you what they do, but as soon as the player unlocks a Dream Nail and uses it, their purpose becomes obvious: collect essence. The game does this small trick in so many sections of the game, like here, in the Ancient Basin, or here, at Crystal Peaks. Or, not you, fuck you. I can't close out this topic completely without talking about the function of training modes in competitive games, hand-holding tutorials, or games without tutorials. But like actually no tutorial this time, like not an invisible one. But we're running out of time. Let me know if you guys want to hear me talk about these things in the comments below, or any other topics you'd be interested in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic at hand. Now, with all that info, anyone can make a good tutorial. I wish. In reality, there are things that make a good tutorial, but there's no perfect set of rules we can follow. I know I sat here and praised certain tutorials for their techniques, but at the end of the day, games are meant to be enjoyed. And some people just won't enjoy some tutorials, while some will. I had a discussion amongst my friends recently about the types of tutorials we liked and didn't like, and what we looked for in good tutorials. Almost nobody shared the same answer, though there were a lot of similarities. I just hope for those of you that see this, that you learned something. I'm no game dev, I'm just some educator that likes to play games, trying to make a subject click with you. This is the part of the outro where I get kind of cringe because it's unscripted. But thank you guys for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed. Go ahead and leave in the comments if you want to go and tell me something about the video, whether you liked it, whether you didn't like it, what you didn't like about it, what you liked about it. Hit that subscribe button if you want to keep up for more, because I do plan to do more videos like this in the future. And if you liked any of the games in the video, catch the stream, because you might see a lot of these on the stream, just saying. Anyways, peace out guys, thanks for watching.